Hey, what's up, folks? This is Tony Brewer. You're listening to or watching, as the case may be, Cogitations. Cogitations is the podcast where we think about things, we contemplate them, we turn them over in our minds, and then we discuss them. Daniel chapter 7, verse 28, Daniel writes, "Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, my countenance changed in me. But I kept the matter in my heart, and we're not going to keep the matter in our heart. We're going to talk about it. And today we're going to talk about the dangers of demonizing your enemies or your perceived enemies. You know, what happened in Pennsylvania with the assassination attempt of a former president of the United States and a current candidate for president of the United States is absolutely deplorable. It should not have happened, but it does not surprise me one bit that it happened. It made me feel some kind of way. I did not like it. I don't know who the assassination. I don't know who the assassin was. I've heard that there was one person who died besides the assassin. So one person was murdered by the assassin, and someone else was gravely injured. When I say gravely, not to death, but it was an injury of some import. And yeah, it's never good. And you wonder, well, how did we get here? Let me explain something. If you constantly cast your enemies or your perceived enemies in the absolute worst possible light that you can imagine, you are responsible for the socio-political climate that we are currently living in, whether it's the right or the left. If you constantly cast your enemies or your perceived enemies in the absolute worst possible light that you can imagine, then what you are communicating, what you are affirming by what you are saying, is that any means necessary to neutralize the threat of your enemies or perceived enemies is acceptable, and you will give no quarter. Now think about Adolf Hitler. If we constantly call a political figure Adolf Hitler, and we constantly compare that political figure and his actions and his desired outcomes, Adolf Hitler, what we are communicating by what we are saying, what we are affirming by what we are saying, is that any means necessary is acceptable for taking that individual out. I'm going to get a little political here, and I'm not even going to be apologetic for it. I'm just front loading it so you know. There is only one side of the political aisle in the United States that is responsible for this. That's the left. And that was evident by what was being said on Twitter moments after the assassination attempt. Things like, well, you had one job. Oh, I can't believe he missed. And the left has been calling for violence since 2016. The left has been lying since 2020, at least, about Donald Trump. Remember, Joe Biden started his campaign by saying that Trump said that there were good people on both sides of a debate, and both sides, and one side of the debate included white supremacists, meaning Trump said that there were good white supremacists. That has been proven time and time again to be an outright lie. But yet, because Trump is, quote unquote, Adolf Hitler, because he has been demonized so badly, then any means necessary to stop him, meaning lying, exaggerating, embellishing, spinning the truth, and evidently now up to and including assassination, is acceptable because any means necessary to neutralize an evil like Adolf Hitler is necessary. This is contrary to God's will. Hello, Petra Simonis, Reginald Perry, and Scott Beck. Good to see y'all. And, I'm sorry that you're dealing with the death of your mom. Well, I'm glad you're back with God's people. That's a good place to be. Now, I have some information to disseminate. I wrote an article, and I'm just going to touch the hem of the garment here because I overlay this idea about the danger of demonizing our opponents, our enemies, our supposed enemies with the teachings of God's word. And I'm like, it's there. So political and social division seems to deepen on a daily basis. And there is a temptation to demonize those who disagree with us. And it grows stronger. I mean, it's very tempting to demonize the left right now. But I tell you what, if we demonize the left, we're no better than them, and there's no off-ramp. I listen to a couple of political pundit podcasters, and they talk about sometimes heading to civil war in the United States, and they're like, the reason we're saying this is because we see in the rhetoric coming from the left, they have backed themselves into a corner with their rhetoric so much that they cannot reconcile with the right. So if Donald Trump does win the election, they have demonized him to the point where there is no road back to reconciliation. That is the problem of demonizing our supposed enemies or opponents. This is why we don't do that with people. Think about if we did this with people in the church. You see, the reason this approach runs counter to biblical teachings, which advocate for reconciliation and understanding and love, even towards actual enemies, is because, think about the parable of the prodigal son. He goes off into the pigsty. If the father had gone around talking about how terrible his old terrible son was and how he's gone off and wasted his fortune and left the home and just demonized him to everybody in the local area where they live, how in the world could he have accepted him back? He may have been able to accept him back, but it would have only been as a servant and not a son. You see, we paint ourselves into a corner like that. Well, let's talk about why demonizing adversaries runs contrary to the biblical model. You know, the teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully persecute you. This is Matthew chapter 5. Hold on a second. Matthew chapter 5, 53 through 40, or 43 through 44. I lost the reference there. Anyway, we are to pray for them which despitefully use us. I don't think we're to demonize those who persecute us. And I think about Romans 12, 19 through 21. In fact, I'm going to just go read it. Romans 12 is an interesting chapter. In my opinion, it's a chapter in how to live separate and apart from the world, but be in the world. In other words, how to live as a sacrifice unto God. I'll get this in a moment. All right. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. You know, there's a layer to this, that if we do good to our enemies, if we love those that hate us, if we do good to them that despitefully use us, we're going to make them mad. Isn't that funny? I think it's funny. In fact, I had a fellow that I used to work with, and so angry and temperamental and elitist was he, that he treated everybody that he thought less than him very terribly. to the point where if he was ever tied up where he needed a hand or he's going to get hurt, it's like something in a cartoon. If people just turned their back and like kind of whistled as they walked off, pretending they didn't see him. But he hated my guts for some reason. Well, I was Johnny on the spot, and if he ever needed anything, I was the one that jumped in and helped him. And the more I did that, the more he hated it, because he knew I was the only one he could depend on. Well, I'm not saying that should be your sole motivation, but if you do that enough, there's bound to at least be some kind of begrudging respect from your enemy. That's why you don't demonize them, because again, there's no path back. And you don't demonize them in your own heart, and you don't demonize them with other people. Think about a husband and a wife. If the husband and the wife have a fight, and she goes to her friends and he goes to his friends, and they both talk bad about their spouse to their friends don't love their spouse the way they love their spouse. So her friends are going to be like, well, I can't believe that you've lost our respect. You've gone back to that terrible, toxic man. And his friends are going to be like, look, dude, how can you put up with the way she treats you? When y'all have reconciled and you don't even, it's water under the bridge for y'all because y'all love each other and y'all have made a vow before God and witnesses to remain together, but yet your circle of friends is trying to split you apart because you went and demonized your spouse to your friends. And then what's the result? A lot of marriages fall because of this. A lot of relationships fall because of this. You don't go and demonize. And incidentally, we had a podcast not too long ago about seeking comfort or I can't remember what the podcast was, but in essence it was, have I sinned because I went to trusted people to vent? And long story short, the venting, it depends on why you're venting. If you're venting to get that off your chest so you can figure out better what to do, and this trusted friend is going to hold you accountable, and this trusted friend is going to keep that to themselves, then you haven't committed any sin. But if you just go vent in order to spread it around, then that's a sin. With this example of going and talking bad about people and venting about people and stuff like that, the more you do this, the more difficult it is to reconcile. And I feel like my train jumped the track because I left the notes. But anyway, let's get back to David and Saul. Let's get back to David and Saul. The Old Testament provides these practical examples of David and Saul. 1 Samuel 24, 6 through 7. We're not going to read it, but this is the account of when Saul was in the privy in the back of a cave, and David was hiding. And David had the opportunity to alleviate himself of Saul's problem. You got me? Instead, he just cut the hem of his garment and explained to him with his actions, I could have done this, but I didn't because you were God's anointed. David was always trying to find a way to reconcile with Saul. Here's the problem. Saul was demonizing David, and therefore there would never be a way back of reconciliation between David and Saul because of Saul's demonization of David. And then, of course, this Luke chapter 23, verse 34, think about Jesus on the cross. If anybody had a right to demonize the people of the moment, it would have been Jesus whenever they had nailed him to the tree. We are called to emulate the actions and character and attitude of Christ. And he prayed for his enemies, his actual enemies, from an agonizing position of agonizing pain on the cross. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, theologically, that wasn't a pronouncement of forgiveness on what they had done. That was just his interceding on their behalf. And in the kingdom, if they obeyed the gospel, they absolutely would be forgiven of that sin. But this is a supreme example of leaving a path of reconciliation, even towards those who unjustly condemned Jesus and those who actually nailed him to the cross and spit on him and tortured him. And it sets the standard for Christian behavior towards our enemies. If it is the case that Jesus was able to say of his enemies who actually personally beat him and despitefully used him and nailed him to a tree, how much more so should we have that attitude towards our supposed enemies, whom we have never even met, who only affect us through several circles of, several degrees of separation. Like, for instance, Joe Biden. Joe Biden, as the president of the United States, has really messed things up. Well, that doesn't affect me. Like, his decisions don't affect me personally. His decisions affect other things, and then there's a domino effect, and then I am personally affected, but it's by his decisions through several degrees of separation. In other words, he's not walking up to me and harming me personally. It's just the system he's created is harming me. And it's so weird to say that he's harming me because I'm in Canada and he's in the United States, but I promise you, so goes the United States, so goes the world. So how much more so should we have an attitude of, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, and we don't demonize our political leaders. Now, we absolutely talk truthfully about the situation. We absolutely make the case of how they are evil in some cases, but we don't demonize them. These actions are evil. These people are evil. There is a path back. And if they stop what they're doing, turn from their ways, and change their policies, then they will have a much better chance of doing what is right. Let's talk about the role of forgiveness in healing and restoration. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, Paul writes, "And be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you." Notice the simile there. A simile is a comparison using like or as. We are to forgive others in the same manner that Jesus forgave us, or that God, for Jesus' sake, forgave us. I think this parallel passage is worded a little bit differently in Colossians, but the issue is, how does God, for Christ's sake, forgive us? Well, we are confronted with our sin, and we are asked to repent and bring forth fruit meet for repentance. That's how we are forgiven by God. Luke 17:3, "Take heed unto thyself, if thy brother trespass against thee, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him." It's an if-then proposition, folks. So, if we demonize our adversaries, or even our supposed adversaries, and we always cast them in the worst possible light, and we always talk about how terrible they are, then we run afoul of offering them the basic fundamental respect that a human being should be offered, and we end up causing things like the assassination of former president / current presidential candidate for the United States. Forgiveness is the key theme in Christianity, folks. It's essential, not just for the spiritual health of the individual, but also for the health of the entire Christian community. So we really need to take heart those words of Paul. And whenever somebody is run afoul of God's standard, we only need to deal with the facts. We don't need to demonize them. We need to pray for them. And we need to be like the father and the prodigal son, and with open arms be ready for their return. Forgiveness, folks, allows the possibility. And forgiveness and long suffering. And I'm not talking about just letting somebody off the hook who hasn't repented. But if they've repented, if we've allowed them a path back because we haven't demonized them so much, then we have this possibility of restoration. And it prevents bitterness and resentment. And these things often accompany the prolonged conflict. Read the history of the Hatfields and McCoys. You know, nobody knows exactly how that feud started, but those two families demonized one another to the point where a Hatfield would shoot at a McCoy, or a McCoy would shoot at a Hatfield, and they would not know why. I want to read the conclusion verbatim of the article. Demonizing adversaries contradicts fundamental biblical principles and teachings, and it hinders reconciliation, perpetuates conflict, and erodes the moral fabric of society. The scriptures call for a radical approach, treating enemies with love, seeking peace, and demonstrating forgiveness as these actions reflect the heart of Christian doctrine and the example set by Christ himself. As society grapples with division, the timeless wisdom of the Bible provides a pathway towards healing and reconciliation, urging believers to see beyond the immediate grievances and to foster an environment where understanding and peace can flourish. This is what we're here to do. We are to be ministers. We are to serve reconciliation. The gospel is a gospel of reconciliation. It was given to the apostles. The apostles pass along the commission to us. Therefore, we, not as ambassadors as the apostles, but as ministers, we serve reconciliation. You cannot reconcile with someone while you are attempting to show the world how terrible they are. Now, let's get into the comment section. And Reginald Perry, your comment here really makes me happy. Scott Beck has got a question. Tony, is marking someone as inept at their job or even calling out someone who is a proponent of abortion, it doesn't appear to be well, come on, Tony. It doesn't appear to be demonization. I'm sure it's a fine line between the two. That's a thing. To be factual. And that's why we need to focus just on the facts. We need to be like Joe Friday and Bill Gannon. Just the facts, ma'am. We don't deal with intentions. We don't deal with motivations. If somebody is advocating for the murder of babies in the womb, that is an evil stance, thereby making that person evil. And we can say that without demonizing them. If a woman was in the comment section and she said, well, you know, I had an abortion and I don't feel like that makes me evil. Ma'am, I totally get it, but you did an evil act for which you are unrepentant. And 1 John chapter 3, verse 7, little children, let no one lie to you, be not deceived. Whosoever doeth righteousness is righteous, even as he, Jesus, is righteous. If that is true, and it is, then the converse is true. Whosoever doeth unrighteousness is unrighteous. That means whosoever doeth evil is evil. If you have murdered your baby, you are evil. I don't care why you've done it. I don't know why you've done it. I know that the very act puts you in the camp of being evil. Now, I can demonize you, and I can talk about your motivations. I can talk about maybe why you've done that, but I don't think that's helpful. It's kind of like the LGBTQ argument back in the early days, whenever it was when the homosexuals were kind of being let into polite society. There was too much demonization. Well, I just can't see how anybody would be attracted. They're just sick. Those people are sick, and I hate them, and they're terrible. I've heard preachers pretty much say those things. And I'm like, well, wait a second. It's a sexual orientation. It's an attraction. And if we're going to be very charitable, which I believe the Bible calls us to be, then we can't allow our disgust to cloud how we deal with these people. It doesn't matter if you can fathom it or not. The fact is, these people And it doesn't matter whether or not they're born that way. Who cares? These people have this attraction, and it's a thorn in their flesh if they're trying to live for Jesus. And let me tell you something. As a unmarried male growing up in this day and age, heterosexual attraction would be a thorn in the flesh. Could you imagine being a heterosexual male who's 17, 18 years old, trying to grow up in this society as it states now and remain sexually pure? Job made a covenant with his eyes. How can these young men make a covenant with their eyes? They can't look anywhere because everything in this society is so highly sexualized. Now, we can demonize a person who has same-sex attraction, and there's no path to reconciliation for them. We don't demonize people who have heterosexual attraction who go off into fornication. Why should we demonize people who have same-sex attraction who go off into fornication? The message is the same for both. There's only one place sanctioned by God whereby you can satisfy your baser urges, and that's the marriage bed. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. That's Hebrews chapter 13. I'll get it in a minute. Check me on that. That's got to be Hebrews 13. So your message to people who have a sexual attraction of any kind, you've got to save that for one person that you're married to. Now you might say, well, Tony, the homosexuals don't have that opportunity. That's exactly right. And Jesus covers that by implication in Matthew chapter 19, where there are some people who are eunuchs for the kingdom. There are some people for whom marriage is not an option. Now, I said all that to bring it back to your question. When I'm looking at a politician such as Joe Biden, I need to focus on the facts. He is demented. He has very obviously soiled himself in public a time or two. Let me walk that back. I'm going to take a page from a political pundit, Tim Pool. There is more evidence that Joe Biden has pooped himself in public than there is that Hunter Biden's laptop was a Russian conspiracy theory, a Russian hoax. Hunter's laptop was set forth as the truth, being the Russian. Well, hold on a sec. Russian disinformation was put forth as an explanation of Hunter's laptop, but there is much more evidence that Joe Biden pooped his pants. He's clearly demented. He is not able to run this country. It has been said by his advisors that he's awake and able to function about 6 hours of the day. Talking about those things and talking about his positions, that's not demonizing. That's just speaking the truth. And we are called to speak the truth. So it's very possible that there could be a fine line between the two. It's kind of like, I guess, gossiping. In order to be guilty of the sin of gossip, there has to be an intention of tearing somebody down. I think that there's plenty of material that Joe Biden and his ilk give us without demonizing. And quite frankly, there's enough material that Donald Trump gives us. We don't have to demonize him. We can just straight out of the front of our mouth say, you know what? He's crass. He's got a foul mouth. He's obviously narcissistic. He don't have a good track record with women. He's living in adultery. So, yeah, I mean, he says some pretty heinous things about women. I get it. Don't overly demonize that. That's the thing. When you don't let your disgust about those things disallow you or prevent you from talking about how amazing he was as a president of the United States. No new wars. He had a logical and reasonable plan to pull out of Afghanistan, not doing what Joe Biden did. and I don't agree with him about this, but, you know, politically, he was the only president to take office who was in favor of gay marriage whenever they began the office. That tells you how far the pendulum swings to the left, by the way. As president, he was a good president. His policies were really good. My disgust at his persona, I'll not allow to color what I think of his policies. Just like I will not allow my disgust at Joe Biden's policies color what I think of his persona. I think that's where demonization comes in. You know, if you demonize Trump and it's always orange man bad, it doesn't matter if he's the best president in the world, and by the time he gets through with his presidency, everybody, you know, the dollar is back to where it used to be. Gas is 86 cents a gallon, and the dollar is back in the lead of the world. There's going to be a subset of people that think he's a terrible president because of the demonization. Hey, Alabama, Trump doesn't hide his crassness on camera. The other candidates do. Absolutely. Well, think about, man, this is so sad. Have y'all read the history of Marilyn Monroe? Marilyn Monroe? Evidently, she was passed around, and the Kennedys just used her up. And John F. Kennedy was a notorious womanizer. Incidentally, I wonder, now that I think about it, speaking of demonization, forgive me if this comes off as demonization, but you had the Kennedys were Democrats. They had issues of sexual scandal and just treating women like objects. You had Bill Clinton, who obviously treated women like objects. You had, and you know, you got Monica Lewinsky and others, and they got a trail of dead people around them. I don't know if there's evidence that Barack Obama treated women as objects. I think his deal was he liked men. That's kind of come out. That's pretty well accepted now. But then I think about Joe Biden, and there's an actual credible sexual assault and really I would say rape accusation that just went the way of the dinosaur. Whenever it come out, that was the end of the Me Too movement. Trump, on the other hand, he had an accusation that was over 30 years old. All this, that, and the other. I'm not even going to go into it, but it was over 30 years old. They changed the law in order for 1 year they could forget about the statute of limitations. It was not credible. It did not have the ring of truth. And in fact, he was not found guilty. He was just found civilly liable, which is a big difference. There wasn't enough evidence to get it to stick in criminal courts, what I'm saying. And then Brett Kavanaugh, who obviously wasn't running for an office, but these uncredible things come out of the woodwork. Russell Brand, these uncredible allegations came out of the woodwork. Anyway, where am I going with that? It seems to me that only one side of the political aisle has all of the credible allegations of sexual assault. And then the other side of the aisle is pretty clean. I think that's why the Me Too movement just kind of fizzled out, by the way. It's because the left wing wanted to demonize all these conservative men with these conservative values, and it flew back in their face. Do you remember whenever Mike Pence was demonized? And I don't think Mike Pence, I think as far as a politician, he's an empty suit and probably part of the deep state, so I don't have much respect for him as a politician. But he had a rule. He said, I'm not going to go out to eat with a woman that's not my wife alone. And the left painted him, demonized him as a womanizer, as a philanderer, as a pervert. I think that's a pretty good scruple to have. That's a pretty good boundary to have. I mean, what if I told you that I have 3 single female friends and I go out, I take in the first week of the month, I take one out to dinner, The second week of the month, I take another. The third week of the month, I take another. And the fourth week of the month, I go on a date with my wife. That just sounds strange to you, wouldn't it? That would cause you to look at me like, well, what do you mean, Tony? Oh, it's just nothing. We just go and hang out and talk, and it's just kind of nice to have this female friend. Well, yeah. You know, that's not holding yourself above reproach. But again, because of the demonization, there's no path back. Folks, I just don't have a whole lot of stuff to say about this today. I think that what we ought to do is we ought to stick with just the facts. Don't worry about motivation. And if you dig back in my past, you'll probably see me violating this exhortation that I'm giving. I'm not a hypocrite. I'm just a human. I'm not perfect. I don't always follow my own advice, but I try. And I think that's what we ought to do. I think we ought to practice 1 Corinthians 13, be very charitable, and if we have to call out ineptness, if we have to call out evil, if we have to call out evil deeds, we need to stick with the facts. Don't embellish. Don't make it any worse than it is. There's enough material there. You don't have to make anything up. You don't have to cast anything in a bad light. Folks, that's all I've got for you. This has been Tony Brew with Cogitations. I hope you would subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and TuneIn Radio. I just re-upped the Podbean channel for a year. I don't know what's going on with the algorithm. We're hovering around, I can't remember the downloads now, but the podcast format changed, and I think it dumped us in the algorithm. So if you would go subscribe to Cogitations on Podbean and maybe listen to some of the content there and share some of the content from there, that would be great. And Substack is just on fire. If you go to Substack and subscribe, you get access to an article in your inbox every morning, and a few hours later, that same article will be delivered, but it'll be in the narration form. And then Aaron puts an article behind a premium paywall every Saturday. And yeah, that's about all. Hey, Alabama, I'm with you. I had to repent of saying things about elected officials. I tried hard not to name call and such. Me and you both. And if you're a human and I'm a human, I dare say, as hard as we try, emotions are probably going to get the best of us at some point in the future, and we'll fall short of this standard that we hold ourselves to. That doesn't make us hypocrites. That doesn't make us failures. That just makes us humans, and we're going to pick ourselves up and keep on a-walking. That's what perseverance is. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you're not in that particular vehicle alone. And that's about all I've got. I've said everything I need to. God bless you. Cogitations on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn.